Hey, welcome to Structure Fishing. I'm Jim Shell. Today's video for you, I have an interview I did with Don Dickson back in May of 2020. For a few months, I was doing a online breakline club. We had online meetings, and this particular meeting back in May of 2020, we had Don Dickson as a special guest. I always enjoy hearing Don tell his stories. They really drive a point across, and most of this interview, if you want to call it, is Don talking about speed control mostly. And it's well worth watching. I'm sure you guys will enjoy it. I really enjoyed it a lot as well. So hopefully I plan on doing a few more interviews during the winter months here, trying to get some other well-known structure fishermen on board. So hope to get those going. But here's Don Dickson talking about speed control. Thanks for watching. Try to stay on topic. I'm going to start talking about speed control. And Don, if you could, in a few minutes here, one of my favorite stories that you've ever told was on your workshop tapes. Was that story about that slow speed control when you were with Buck up in Lake Pepin?
Yep.
If you wouldn't mind telling that story in a couple of minutes
Yep.
here.
That was one that I wouldn't forget because people still talk about it, and I always think about it. It really drove the point home, and a lot of the training with Buck. Most of the time, when we'd just be fishing, like on that trip you're referring to, we were just fishing, but only because he loves going up there. He loved going up there for the white bass. After the walleyes had done their thing, the white bass are cramming in there, feeding on all of that walleye stuff. So he loved being up there at that time of year. And this was my first trip with him to Lake Pepin. I subsequently had a school there and a lot of other times, was up there with him. But this particular time was my first trip with him to Lake Pepin, and it was cold. And as he would like to do on many other occasions as well, when it was freezing cold, he'd stay in the camper and say, "Oh, Donnie," he said, "man, I got some stuff I got to finish up for Fishing Facts. They've been hollering at me. I'm late on this article. I got to get this thing finished. So you go out there and find some fish for me, will you? Let me know what you find out." He'd send me out there, 28 degrees. I didn't want to be out there, and never having the right clothes, but he'd stay in the warm camper. So I went up to this nice big long bend in the river where I knew that the white bass should have been. And it just kind of come out around 4, 5, 6 feet and then break off into deeper water. So I'm fishing that, 0 to 6 feet. That's what I'm fishing, looking for these white bass that should have been in there. But the weather was so bad, I just couldn't be sure that they hadn't dropped off, and were actually gone. So I fished for about a half a day on that one area. I don't know how many drifts I made down through there. I made some trolling passes, but I knew the trolling passes was too fast. So I had to slow up. So I, of course, went to the jigs, and I had a little current in there, of course. So I'm making a drift, but I made one drift. I think it was like a 3/8 or a quarter ounce jig, just a normal go down through there and just throw towards the bank. And it's one time we're looking like Bass Pros, but didn't catch a fish. And I was convinced they were there. So I went up about a mile. I made a mile drift, no fish. Went up. I said, I'm going to do this again, but I'm going to lighten up on that jig and go, to 8,000. Really jump that bait slowly, slow as I could go. And I go down for a mile, no fish. So by the time I finished up there, I'd spent about a half a day there, no fish. So I figured, okay, I was wrong. They're not there. I have to find another spot or 2 or 3. So I went, cruising all over the place looking for some other good stuff. Didn't find anything in the way of fish. It was one of the first times and one of the few times that I could ever remember I was fishing with Buck or without Buck on a trip with Buck that I spent a day and didn't catch any fish. But I guarantee you I was frozen. So the next day he said, well, after he heard what all I had done and where I had done it, showed him on the map, he said, oh, those fish are there. We'll go up, we'll go catch him tomorrow. So, okay. I knew they weren't there though. I had established they weren't there. So we go, I'm seeing this slide that says color, action, size, depth, speed. Is that what you want up?
Yeah, I was just going to talk about,
Yeah, I want you to be able to leave it up, but I need to show the guys that we're talking to exactly what we did to catch those fish. It's better to show them rather than to just say it. If you can throw me back up there for a minute.
sure, sure.
Okay, so we go up with Buck, and we're on this big long bend, on the outside bend. We're fishing this big area. I say a mile. It was at least a mile. Could have been closer to 2, but long distance. And we come down through there jigging like you normally would. He said, and we made the one whole pass, no fish. So he says, take me back up there again. And back then I'm running a small engine, and we didn't have trolling motors back then. The world had them, but Buck and I didn't have them. So I'm, juggling, positioning with the gas motor, 10 horse. So I'm running a motor, he's casting, and we make another drift. And I'm casting too. But we lightened up on the jig. Same thing I did the day before. Just barely jumping that bait. Throw it in towards the bank, jump it out, get out to that 6 feet, boom, next cast. So at the end of that pass, no fish. And I'm just begging him to let's go find some fish. They're not here. He said, Donnie, I can smell them. Those fish are here. And he said it like I've heard him say things before. He meant he really knew that those fish were in there. So he said, let's go back up there and make another pass. I said, oh man, come on. I'm saying to myself, I'm young at the time, pretty young. I was about 30 or 31. So, I'm wanting to go. Let's go, He said, no, we're going to make another pass down through there. So we come down the third time. And I swear, I can't remember today whether it was, excuse me, third pass or the fourth pass. I was really getting upset. I wanted to move. He said, no, they're there. On the last pass we're making down through there, we're drifting down through there. I'm jocking the engine and still trying to cast myself, but he's making all these casts. And we get about 50 yards down on the last pass, and he hooks a fish. And if any of you have fished Lake Pepin, they've got tons and tons of 2.5, 3 pound white bass. They got big ones, and it's a big fish. So he brings that fish in, and he just looked at me, and he'd always do this in a situation like that, because we basically had been skunked for 2 hours, He just looked over at me and just sort of smiled and looked back, boom, make another cast. So on the next cast, he catches fish number 2. On the third cast, he catches fish number 3. I'm still doing what I'm doing, nothing. So I said, okay, Buck, what the heck are you doing? He says, I was wondering how long it would take you to ask me. He said, watch this. He takes and he makes a cast, same as we've been doing for 2 days. I've been doing for 2 days, to the edge of the bank, It was either 1/8 ounce or even lighter maybe, but just enough, I think we're using 8-pound test. We could get the lure in there. And instead of jumping the bait, even just a little bit, he just started barely turning his reel handle. Now, you got to remember, there's current. Basically, it's the Mississippi River. There's current coming down through there. So these little wiggle tail jigs that we're using, that wiggle tail is working in the current, but he's just barely pulling the lure towards the boat minutely. I'm talking about the reel handle, but no jumping of the lure like you normally would. Not even a little short jump, because we had tried all that. But he just started turning that reel handle, bang, he had another fish. I make a cast, just turn that reel handle, bang, I got a fish. Now we went that way, I'm not kidding you, both of us had 2 fish on at least for the next 30, 35 minutes. Each having a fish on at the consecutive cast. And then I said, I can't stand it. I'm just thinking, did the fish just become active? Or was it speed control all along? So I said, I got to try. So I make a cast, and did like we were doing, just a little jump, pick it up, little jump, pick it up, nothing. Throw right back as close to the same spot as I could, just barely turn the reel handle, boom. We caught, that afternoon, we caught, I'm not exaggerating, at least 200 weight bass. Just barely turning that reel handle. It would keep the lure from hanging up. In other words, you had to move it or it would hang up in the rocks. So you had to move it, but that's how he was moving it, just turning the reel handle. When that was all over, he said, I guess you'll never forget the importance of speed control, will you? I said, no, I'll never forget that. I fished basically for a day and a half in this exact same water, catching no fish, zero fish. And when Buck got up on that speed control and hit it just right, we caught 200 fish out of the same exact spot. And when we tried, and then he ended up trying to go back to just jumping it, we wouldn't catch a fish. Now, isn't that something? Something I never forget. In fact, a guy asked me just 3 days ago, called on the phone, and he was talking about the reverse of that. How fast do you go? He thought because he was going at times like 6 mile an hour, that was too fast. He was looking to maybe get less of an engine, to try to slow down. I said, man, we need to talk. And I showed him a picture of, it was on one of the vlogs. I think I just threw it in there one time saying a lesson in speed control. When I had the opposite. I'm down in Lake Yosemite, the first trip, but I was finishing making this bass tape. And when I got into the fish on a break line to a slot out in the middle of the lake, break line to a 17-foot slot, the fish were so fast, it was either late August or early September, I think. Could have been October, but that fall of the year, you have good activity, but yet the water is really still warm from the summer. So I was going so fast to hit the fish, 250s and 200s. I said to the camera guy, of course, back then when you shoot and film, you just didn't turn the camera on and shoot because you're burning up a lot of money, So you'd wait till you hit a fish and then the guy would turn the camera on and film it. So the fish were taking it so fast. I said to the camera guy, I said, listen, I want you to take a shot of me from the time I start to leave the line out on this trolling pass. And of course, it's all trolling. And I said, I want you to have a shot where you see the reel, see me, see the shoulder, see the markers that I'm running by. And at the same time, I want you to be able to see the wake in the back of the boat. I want people to get a real idea of how fast you have to go sometimes, especially when you're talking about largemouth bass or smallmouth. But the bass is such a fast fish. And when you couple that with Florida, in the 85, 87, 88 degree water, I said, I thought I was going about 10 miles an hour. That was my guesstimate. And this guy said, what? I said, just look up that film, take a look at it. I think it's in the presentation of lures, mechanics, fishing, in one of my vlogs. But at any rate, it was perfect. I let the line out and I talked about counting layers, of course. I'd already done all of that. We let the line out and he saw me thumb down. And I told him when he was doing it, I says, do not shut that camera off till I catch fish. I said, it probably only going to take 2 or 3 minutes because fish were active. I was on them. We had caught 8, 10, 12 by then anyhow. So I said, just keep filming. I think it was about 1.5 minutes. And I want you all to look that up if you haven't seen it. You can see that big wake in the back of the boat. You can see how fast I was going. And I made a little bit of a turn on one of the fingers. And shortly thereafter, you could see the fish take, and then you could see the fish jump out behind the boat. I think about 14 layers out, I think. And it landed a fish, it was about 6 pounds. But it showed the other side of speed control, 10 mile an hour versus barely moving that bait. And I could tell you a few more stories if we had time, which we don't, but I can tell you a few more stories where speed control, it's always on my mind. If I'm not catching fish, either my depth or my speed is wrong. And I was around buck for 35 years. And not only being around them, but actually learn from them, but then teaching it. And the more you teach, the more you learn, the better you get. And after all of the experiences, I was talking to a guy the other day, we fished every river in the United States from the east to the west, every major river, we fished them all, plus all the reservoirs, all the Great Lakes, all the natural lakes, all this experience. And all of a sudden, when I'm not catching fish, I know my depth control is probably right because I'm covering all my features from 0 to 60 feet. So somewhere in there, I've got the right depth control. But if I'm not catching fish, just like we weren't catching those white bass in 2 feet of water until we slowed down, the speed control will be the answer. So depth and speed catching fish. Buck said it 1,000 million times. You can answer every fishing failure or every fishing success in these two terms, depth and speed. So you can't say anything more important. That's it. Depth and speed catch fish. And sometimes it's extreme.
Right. I think it's just like you said, Don, once you experience it yourself and you really learn, it's a permanent lesson. It stays with you all the time.
Yes. And Buck was big on that. I was with him I was teaching in his schools, weekend schools, mainly weekend schools, on the water weekend schools, and doing his lectures for 7 years before he felt comfortable that we could pull off a summer school up in Canada where you have, 50 or 60 people a week and do that for 8 weeks, like the first one we did in 78, I guess, or 79. But I know what his reason was, which he shared with me at a later time. He wanted to make sure, he said, you can't teach people from all over the country. You can't teach them everything they need to know if you haven't experienced it yourself. And I'm not talking about you reading about it. I'm talking about you experiencing it. How are you going to talk about fishing a tail race if you haven't fished one? How are you going to talk about fishing, Lake Erie if you haven't fished the Great Lakes, And you just had to learn everything to his satisfaction because as far as he was concerned, yeah, I'm his disciple, but I can't be saying something that's not right because then that reflects back on him. So he was concerned about that. And he said, the only answer, he said, you've done all the book work, you've done all that stuff. I printed half of the new advanced material. I knew that stuff, but it's another thing to experience it. You really don't understand it until you experience it. So I encourage people, fish different water. Don't just fish the same lake all the time or the same structures all the time. Go out and fish different stuff. You'll become a better fisherman. It's that simple. Yep.
Yeah, it's just, that was one of the points that I wanted to make that, like Bucket said, I personally think that at least half the time you don't catch fish, it's because you didn't have the right speed control that day if you check the structure thoroughly throughout the day.
Yep. Agreed. I really push, I really pushed the map and interpretation, but I always felt that just going in and doing a one-night lecture or a 2-day school, something like that, if people don't have the background, and most of the people that you're surrounded with, they've read the book, they've read the material, they know Buck stuff. And then you can be way more effective in teaching an on-the-water mapping and interpretation class. Like someone mentioned, Chase Kleinstecker. I actually made fun of him once on tape and I had to apologize to him later that night at dinner because we were talking about in mapping and interpretation is getting you on that right spot, really getting on the right spot, not just the right structure, but the right spot to make those final casts and check all those different speed controls to establish they're not here right now. Buck said every time we fish a structure, before we leave, we got to be able to say without any doubt, they ain't here right now. We'll come back, maybe. Let's go look for something else. So we have to be that thorough, and that not only is speed control, but the depth control, but where depth control, not just so much the depths, but where a certain depth on the finger, on the wash, whatever it is, on the brakes, on the brake lines. You have to be precise in both of those things. So we can say, if we didn't catch a fish, they're not here. They're just not here right now. They're going to be here at some time, maybe not today, maybe tomorrow, the next day, but they're not here now. We know for sure. And that's checking both, all depths at the right place and checking all speeds.
Right.
I became fanatical about it, but with Chase Kleinstecker, if none of you heard the story, I'm teaching this class of about 5 or 6 boats. I'd take 5 or 6 boats at a time, and we'd do a mapping class in the morning. And then after lunch, I'd take another 5 or 6 boats with different 2 guys in a boat. And we'd, do a hump and do saddles and do bars and, all the different types of structures that were available at the school. And Chase was a student. I think this was his 2nd trip. And everybody was catching a lot of fish. It was a good trip. But most guys like Chase, they're there for the training. They want to catch fish, but they're really there for the training. So I hit that on the water mapping and interpretation hard. But I also tried to, was one of my goals when I first started with Buck, was to take all of the kind of ways that he wrote and talked and simplify it to people more like me. Not that I consider myself a dumb person, but I consider myself of average intelligence. But I wanted to simplify some of the stuff he said to make it more understandable to most fishermen. So I came up with this step 1, 2, 3, 4 in the mapping interpretation. And we went out and we trained it. Now, the first thing on the list was, we come to a structure, and this structure I'm talking about here, with Chase and his partner, we came to a bar. I said, now, first thing we got to know is, will this structure produce fish? We have to know that before we start doing any other work on it. So we have to first establish, does it lead all the way from the shallows to the deep? And then I said, now, you guys have a head start on this one. We know it leads to the shallows, it leads to the shoreline. We're sitting up there in about 2 feet of water, with all these boats. And I said, so we know it leads from the shallows, but does it lead to deep water? So I said, your number one thing you have to do first is establish, will it produce? So we got to see, does it lead all the way? The way I normally would do it on a bar, I'm just going to head out in the lake, and looking at the formation on the shore, I can pretty much guesstimate about how it's laying, and I'll just head straight out what I think is going to be off the end of the bar, that direction. Even though I don't know where the end of the bar is, I can sort of guess it. I'm going to head straight off that bar and see if it leads to deep water. Now, in the area of the Winnipeg River system where we did all those schools for 20 years, everything leads to 90 feet. I mean, it leads. But then the second question we have to answer is, what is that final break to deep water? What is the drop-off? What depth is the drop-off occurring? Buck used to say it has to be between 14 and 17 feet. If I were to ever sort of adjust some of Buck's writings, today it's a little bit different. It's a little deeper. I like to see something going from 17 to 25 and off. But if it's 15 to 17, will I fish it? Yes. But most of you guys...
If I can interrupt you for a second, I'm just curious.
Yeah.
What was the watercolor up at the Menaki all those years?
Well, in the river, it wasn't too bad. It was a yellow-green. Anytime you have moving water with all those lakes and stuff, you're going to have some yellow-green. And the good news up there was that have a multitude of different type structures, but you also had structures that you could read to 37, to 42, to 47. My wife, I think the last time we were there, we went up just for a fun trip to fish some muskie in northern late in the fall. It was early September. And on the way back to the lodge one night, I said, let's make a pass on our summertime stuff for the walleye and see if we can't catch one. And she loves running the river rig. She loves running spoon plugs deep. She loves running wire. So we make a pass on the deepest drop off, which was 47 feet, nothing. And it's about a 300-yard pass. Nothing, not one fish. I said, man, we can't go in without catching a fish. She said, you're right, let's make another pass. I said, but this time, let's make a pass on the base break line. In other words, 47 goes off into 60 feet, and then it stops, 60 feet. That's it, that's the deepest water. So I said, let's fish that base at 60 feet. And we fished it real slow. We got about halfway up there to one of the spots where there's a definite hook, an inside hook. And we got our lure up in there at 60 feet, and she hit a 36-inch, 13-pound walleye in September 2nd. There was no eggs or anything, you know, it wasn't spawning. And that was a hog. I was thinking during the spawn, that would have been a pretty miraculous fish. But we caught that fish at 60 feet. And so much of the structure up there, you could read it deep. So even under bad daily weather and weather conditions, I knew I could go out there and catch fish, guaranteed. And that's what made it so good, because most of the guys wanted to come to learn, but they also want to catch fish. They're like me. If I'm not catching fish, don't talk to me for a while. My kid always says, you always say, shut up for a minute until we hit a fish. So yeah, I'm still pretty serious about it. I don't like not catching fish. And most people don't, they just don't all admit it.
Yeah.
Much prefer catching fish. So getting back to it, I sent Chase, I said, now we're gonna go through procedures. I'm gonna have each boat do a little something different, but on this structure, and I just happened to point to Chase's boat. He was driving, that's the reason I remember it. I said, Chase, I want you to go out and make sure that this structure will produce. I don't want to waste any time on it, even mapping. And I had not fished this spot. I didn't know what it was. All I knew was there was a formation on the shore. You knew there was a bar there. I didn't know where it led or how it led or anything. So I said, or how, you know, where the features were. So I said, you go out and go through step one and establish for me if this structure produces. Once you've got that answer, and you know you're going to answer the second question at the same time as you going off that structure, and it does lead to deep, I want you to also recognize what's the final break to that deep water. So you've answered the first two questions on one pass. Only take you 30, 40, 50 seconds. Get both answers. So I want you to get that answer and come back and tell the group, we'll just sit here and wait for you. Let us know if that thing is productive or not. He took off in about the same direction I would go, but he never stopped. He kept on going, and he kept on going, and he kept on going. And I'm looking around at the guys, and one of the guys finally said, where the heck is he going? I said, I don't know. Because you know, he's 200 yards away now. You know he's come to deep water a long time ago. So he's left the structure, in essence. And he's 200 yards across the river and probably going to hit something on the other shore if he kept on going. I swear, I think he must have gone, I think he went 3/4 of a mile or a mile, possibly that far. We could barely see his boat. Would look like it was an inch long, you know, you could barely see him. And we're just going, so I tried to make something out of it after I made a little bit of fun about it, you know. But I told the other guys that were sitting around talking, we were critiquing him. And I said, this is a lesson that he's never going to forget, because I'm going to ride him pretty good on this. I said, but you should never forget it either. Once you leave these 4 steps that I've written down for you, you're messed up. You're going to spend 5 hours trying to figure out whether or not this structure will produce. Ridiculous. Shouldn't take you more than a minute. And sure enough, when you went off that thing, it broke right off at 27 feet, you know, into 35 or 37 and 37 off into 60. I mean, pow, you got the answers, everything you needed right there. But yet he's nearly a mile away. And when he finally came back in, he threw a marker somewhere, you know, and he was just so wrong. I thought, I'll be honest with you, don't tell him I said this, but I thought at that time, this guy will never make it. He's never going to make it. But he was one of those guys that did, in fact, have a determination. He stayed with it and the more we laughed about it, then I apologized to him later. I'd said some halfway cutting things, but in jest, but I guess it wasn't all that funny to him at the time. But he took it pretty good. But not only would the guy sitting there watching it learn something from that, but so would Chase. Chase would never do that again. Does it lead all the way? You got that from here. You got that in 50 yards out there in the lake, you got your answer. Yeah, it leads all the way. So the next step is, what's the primary break line? Get on it, follow it around, and mark all the unusual features on that break line. What's the next step? If it has multiple break lines, do the same thing, because sometimes a deeper break line will turn off and create some beautiful long finger that didn't show up at the shallower break lines. And that is going to be the contact point, the deepest break to the deepest water. We'll find all of that out, but only after we establish. So it was kind of, I still sort of laugh about it, but the more I thought about it after we left that summer, Chase will never forget that. Neither will those guys that were sitting with me watching him, and neither were all the other students that we discussed that with that week. Follow the procedures. You never go wrong. Step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4, take soundings. Where's my contact point? Right there. That was one of the most amazing things that I never could figure out for about 2 years meeting Buck. Every time, it didn't matter where we were. So my second trip I made with him was to Pickwick, down to TVA, down Tennessee. We're out in the middle of that reservoir, no more than 20 minutes. He drills his finger in the water and say, there they are. Back the boat up, threw a marker, and back the boat up, anchored down. We're casting to a school of big smallmouth, right? 20 minutes on the lake. And he would do that all the time. He said, you got to be able, when you're done with your mapping, you got to be able to throw your finger and say, there they are, right there. There's my fish. That way, we know that we can check all of the depths in relationship to that contact point, and we can check all of our speeds. And if we don't catch one, he ain't there. What was that? Somebody's at the casino.
I think everybody's on mute now, except for you and I. But get back. I think one thing that grabs a new person in the spoon plugin and what opens their eyes when they is summertime, the speed control. When the average fisherman can't catch anything, and then guy, spoon plugger goes out there, understands speed control, and makes a big catch. And I can remember, I'm sure you can remember thousands of times yourself. You take someone new that's isn't familiar with spoon plugging, you put them in a boat in a summer situation, fast speed, and people are astonished at how fast you're going and catching fish.
They can't believe it. Absolutely can't believe it. And Buck used to say, well, those little minnows that are swimming around down there, so they can swim in bursts of 25, 30 mile an hour, and they're not a bass alive. Can't catch one when he wants one. So if you're trolling 10 mile an hour, who said that's too fast? It's not too fast. I've got living proof of that, and I've got it on film too. We were going so stinking fast. One of the things that when we start talking about speed control that I remember just from personal stories is not only the fastest that we could ever go, but then the slowest. Great example how sometimes just your mental awareness of the importance of speed control could make all the difference in the world. I'm up at the summer school in year 3, I think, or year 4. Got about 800 students coming. It's going to be a big year. So I went a few days early to establish that my fish seasonally, they're still in this area that I really had pinpointed. And I caught some fish, but I wasn't catching a bunch. So it's a little concerned, but I figured, well, by tomorrow, I only had maybe a couple hours to fish that first day. But the next day, I went out and I had my wife with me, and she's an excellent troller, better than any other student that I can only name maybe 2 or 3 that are actually better. She's really great, so I can trust that her lure's in position. And I said, we got to establish if these fish are really here, because it changes what I'll be doing this first week. So we go out, in about, I'd say, an hour and a half, we had caught just maybe two, like 4-pounders or something. They, and this is an area we catch 6, 7, 8, 9, 10-pounders regularly, and lots of them. So I really was concerned, and all of a sudden I could feel this wind coming up, and it was one of those things that it didn't take but about 45 minutes. We had, in this little narrow section where I have a saddle that I'm fishing, I say narrow, it's 150 yards wide, but it necks down into this 150-yard wide thing and then goes for a distance and then widens back out. When in between there's a saddle, and it's normally loaded with fish, and the top of it's 35 feet. It breaks at 37, breaks again at 42, breaks again at 47 into 60 feet. It's a dream for people like us that fish like we fish. So all of a sudden, this 8-mile-an-hour current that's coming downstream, we're trolling upstream, of course, we couldn't catch fish. And the longer we fished, the windier it got. And finally, at one point, it was so windy, but I was so determined, I have to know if those fish are there or if they're not. So finally, at one point, I looked at the shoreline, and I know you've been there at one time or another. I'm going upstream against this current, and I've got a slow speed control on my lure, of course, but I'm not catching. And when I look at the shoreline, I notice that if I put it up into neutral, the wind is so strong from down below me that it's overcoming this 10-mile-an-hour current coming this way. Now think about that. I'd never run into that before. I get a 10-mile-an-hour current. The wind is so strong, it's overcoming that current and pushing me faster. I didn't have good depth control. I didn't have good speed control. And I thought, man, what the heck am I going to do? But now all I'm thinking is speed control. I've never done this, but I'm going to try it. It hit me. I'm going to go upstream. I'm going to troll down current against that strong wind, because I know all the spots on the saddle. There's 2 or 3 fingers, and there's a hook where Allie caught her 6, her 13.5-pounder. But I said, I'm going to go upstream and troll downstream, but against that wind, I'll be able to basically almost stop that lure right at the key spots. We're coming downstream, first pass, I got way too much line out, and we get hung up right away. I said, okay, we got to fine tune this, and we made maybe, I don't know, maybe a 3 or 4 layer reduction in how much line we were laying out. We came down again. We had to get the lure down, but with the current going down with the current, it's easy to get hung up. So we had to really, the minute we started it, I pick it up a little bit, and I'm going just enough against that wind, even though the current's pushing. With the wind blowing so hard, we were just barely moving that lure, going downstream. We hit that first hook, pow, 9 pounds. Fish back, run back upstream again, come down into that same hook, pow. As soon as the lure got to that hook, before it turned, pow. And my wife will tell you, we still have a picture. I think we caught 12 fish, and the smallest fish was 6 pounds, but most of them were about 7 pounds and bigger. All sitting right in that hook, but you couldn't get to it with the wind and but by adjusting and just doing something off the wall to create a certain depth and speed control based on those conditions was the difference between catching nothing and loading the boat, which most walleye fishermen would think that was the catch of a lifetime. Even my wife was pretty excited about that catch. She said, that's a good one, going downstream in the river. And she jokes about it today. But again, those things are based on all Buck's teachings and drilled into me. So I was able to make that adjustment. And in that particular case, it turned the trick big time. Just like the white bass, not jumping the bait, it was everything. It was the difference. So depth and speed. That's all I ever think about. Got to create it. Buck used to say, when you really were getting to the going too fast thing, Buck used to say, when you think in the summer months, when you think you're not catching fish, you got to speed up. Keep cranking that motor up a little bit. Keep taking it up another notch. And he said, when you get going where you know you're going way too fast, he said, go a little faster. You'll probably be just right. That was his little comical way of saying it. You ain't going fast enough. You got to move, especially for the bass. Now, I've had the walleye when they're pretty darn fast too, but not like a bass. Bass are really fast. And of course, that's still my favorite fish.